Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our second informal webinar. So for those of you who missed our first webinar yesterday, let me briefly give a little bit of context. And for those of you who were there yesterday, apologies for the repetition. So in essence, my name is Koen de Koning. I am an economist in the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and I'm currently working on a review paper on environmental impacts along food supply chains and what we can do about them. And while researching that piece, I realized that actually just in the last few years, there's been an explosion of new initiatives, new research, new data sets that have become available, but also new policy developments and new initiatives by the private sector, by civil society, and so on. And I thought it would be a nice idea just to connect the dots and basically connect people who are working on all these interesting initiatives with each other, to learn from each other and get to know each other. At the same time, we've all had our fair share of webinars, so we were also trying to have a little bit of a new format for these things. So the way it works is this webinar consists of two parts. The first part is half an hour, and that part will be recorded. And this is always going to be a presentation of about 20 minutes, followed by some Q&A. And then that sort of finishes the plenary part, let's say the official part. And then we have, for those who want to stick around, we have optional small random breakout groups. And the idea there is really to stimulate the kind of networking opportunities that you would otherwise have at a physical meeting, but which are harder to do in the virtual context. So that's in a nutshell how we did it last time, yesterday for the first one. It went quite well, so I hope today will be at least as good. Once the breakout session is finished, by the way, we're not going to come back to the full session for some sort of debrief or whatever. We'll just send you all on your way, and then we'll meet again for the next informal webinar. So I'll be in touch also the next few days with more details on the next few webinars, as well as with PowerPoint presentations and links to recordings of the webinar of yesterday and today. So that being said, also if you have any other questions, either for us or for the speakers or for other people you met during the breakout sessions and you didn't get a chance to ask them today, feel free to just send us an email and we'll be happy to connect you. So with that, let me introduce the speakers today. And so we're very pleased to have three OECD colleagues joining us today. So this is Shivani Kannabhiran, Rena, Hinoshita, and Sophia Gnych of the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. So Shivani and Rena both focus on agriculture and responsible agricultural supply chains, while Sophia does cross-cutting work on environmental and climate issues. What exactly is responsible business conduct and what exactly is the role of due diligence? You may have heard a lot about due diligence initiatives lately. I'll leave it to them to explain that. So I don't know which one of you three will start first. Shivani, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Koen, and it's great to see so many of you and see so many familiar names. It would actually really be helpful if folks would put the name of their organization maybe somewhere in their name so that we can, I mean, I know some of you, but certainly not all of you, so that will help me out a lot. Sophia, do you mind bringing up the PowerPoint? That'll be terrific. Look, this is really an informal webinar on our work on responsible business conduct in food supply chains. My name is Shivani Kannabhiran. I'm the sector lead for our work on responsible agricultural supply chains. So I'll walk you through some of the work we're doing. Rena Hinoshita is an analyst. She'll also be presenting a few of the slides. And then we have Sophia, who works with us on particularly on climate and environment. And as many of you know, climate and environment is really, well, put it this way, the agricultural food sector is really a key player in ensuring that we meet many of the climate goals and our ambitions. And we need to do so really quickly. So we need all hands on deck. Let's start with the first slide then. So when we speak about responsible business conduct in agriculture, we're looking at, and I think all of you are well aware of the pressures we're facing: growing global population, rising demand for food. What we are doing and the work that we do on the responsible supply chains is really done quite closely and in collaboration with the FAO. So the FAO and OECD, we are working towards really encouraging the uptake of responsible practices, business practices along global agricultural supply chains. And one could argue we're really looking at also value chains, because we're talking to companies, and by that we also include the whole range, so we're talking to producers, food manufacturers, input suppliers, so seed, fertilizers, investors, again, traders, all the way up to the retail and restaurants, etc., as well as governments. So what are the policies governments can put in place? What is it when we talk about the toolbox, the famous toolbox that governments have? What's in OECD parlance, we often talk about that smart mix of policies. But importantly, we also integrate the views and perspectives of stakeholders, because when we talk about due diligence, it's really a risk management process, but it's one that I would say the value add is that it also integrates the perspective of stakeholders that you may not normally be talking to or thinking about. So beyond just the private sector and the suppliers and different companies, to work as well with civil society, to get the views and perspectives and actually knowledge of unions and trade union workers. So really, how can we do that? And as Koen mentioned, we also work quite a bit with what we called market mechanisms in a broadest sense of the term. And here we're talking about standard setters, auditors, audit firms, folks that actually help really integrate or operationalize these commitments or these standards in real life. And I'm happy to take questions throughout, but we'll stop at the end for a bunch of questions, I'm sure. So our goals are really to make a positive contribution to the economic. I mean, we know that the ag sector, the food sector is a positive contributor to economic growth, but also to watch out for the environmental and social progress that can be done. And we do that primarily through identifying and avoiding some of the negative impacts that can happen, both in a company's own activities, in its own operations, right? And I can give you examples of that as we talk about it, but also throughout their supply chain. And this is a relatively novel or rather newish concept when you talk about corporate responsibility or even ESG. For many, many years, almost over a decade, over 2 decades, CSR from a company's perspective tended to be very much about my operations, my company. And if anything, they would begin to think about their first level suppliers. What we're talking about is really moving along the full supply chain. And that, of course, becomes a lot more complex, a lot more difficult. So again, we're identifying and preventing harms. And when we're talking about harms here, we're talking about harms to people and the planet, right? In global supply chains. We're working with the full value chain and all the stakeholders, but obviously these recommendations are targeted to companies, right? And the goal ultimately is through responsible business, our ultimate vision is that we'll have better development outcomes. So food security, nutrition, a planet that's operating within planetary boundaries, and ways that we can do that. Let's go to the next slide. Just wanted to give you a snapshot. We know there's been, as you can see from here, just in the last 10, 12 years, there's been a real increase in regulation on responsible business conduct. And this is just work that we've seen. Many of them are cross-cutting across different sectors, but a number of them are also targeting the agricultural sector. So you'll see here from the early days in 2010, the California Transparency Act, Lacey Act. In there, actually, there was a major area that was the U.S. Conflict Minerals Act, and that really started making this link between our OECD work on responsible business and due diligence and investment in, I would say, high-risk areas. But as you can see along just over the years, we had in 2015 the UK Modern Slavery Act, and then look, we're looking today a number of proposals, notably from the EU, but also from a number of OECD countries. So we're seeing this real pressure, and that governments are acting, certainly using one of the tools in their toolbox, which is regulation, to level the playing field and move forward in meeting a number of expectations, I would say, linked to the Sustainable Development Goals at the end of the day. And I just want to caveat again, one thing to keep in mind is that the work that we do at the RBC Centre and the work at the OECD on this, we developed the standards and we developed the voluntary guidelines, let's say, or principles, which are increasingly being cited and referenced in legislation. So as you know, or you may not know, but the OECD, it's not a legislative making body. So we don't create laws, but a number of our work, particularly on our RBC Centre, is beginning to seep into legislation. If you could go to the next slide, please. And here I'm turning it over to you, Rena, is that right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. So Shivani just mentioned the OECD legal instrument recommendation and expectation around the responsible business conduct in the agriculture sector has been cited and directly referenced in the different voluntary and mandatory regulation frameworks. And the OECD expectation is what you see on the slide, which is OECD-FAO Guidance for Responsible Agricultural Supply Chain. So this is the expectation around responsible business conduct from government to businesses. And this guidance was launched in 2016 following 2-year multi-stakeholder consultation process, including government, business, investors, unions, civil society organizations. And this guidance is aligned with the main international standard. For example, UN Guiding Principles and the ILO Multinational Enterprise Declaration, as well as OECD guidelines. Also, like internationally recognized standard in agriculture sector, for example, CFSI and BJGP, and as well as some certain environmental standard, for example, Convention on Biological Diversity. So that this guidance provides first two components. The first component is providing the model policy for companies to embed in their management system, and then also practical framework for companies to manage risks in their own operation and also along the whole supply chain. And then in turn, company can make bigger contributions to sustainable development. So that's the objective of this guidance. And then this guidance is applied to all the companies that in any size, including multinational enterprise and also small, medium-sized enterprise as well. And from production, aggregation, processing, distribution, as well as investors and input suppliers are like cross-cutting industry actors as well. And this guidance also covers not only environmental risks, also human rights, labor rights, and other public health and safety, also land tenure rights and technology innovation, and animal welfare, etc. And so, yeah, let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, like this guidance have like two main components. One is model enterprise policy, and then another is this practical framework to implement risk-based due diligence along the supply chain. So as you can see, OECD-FAO guidance laid out 5-step, like step-by-step, easy to follow framework for the companies to actually carry out due diligence in a daily basis as part of their daily operation, daily activities. And what do they, I'm not going to go into like every single step today, but I just wanted to give you some like essentials like due diligence. So you can see on the right side. So basically due diligence is a process. It's not the one-off activities company will do, but it's a process companies should take to carry out to identify and prevent and mitigate and account for how they address the risks in their supply chain. And this is a kind of one major component that makes different from like traditional compliance approach. It's a process, and there's a feedback system to improve their action and activities over and over. So that's how basically due diligence process should be always dynamic and ongoing, responsive, and informed by not only the internal reporting system, but also by engaging with stakeholders to provide any areas for improvement, and then more, for example, like how they can do better risk assessment, etc. So this stakeholder engagement is one key point to make due diligence more effective. And then due diligence is not first and foremost, basically the focus is avoiding the risks, but also if those risks cannot be avoided, the next step for company is to think of how they can prevent and mitigate risks and or their recurrence. So that's the due diligence, the core part of the due diligence. And then I'm talking about repeating risks, but company cannot address risks, all the risks along the supply chain at once. So this 5-step framework for risk-based due diligence recommend company to assess risks and then prioritize risks to which risks they should tackle first or second based on severity and likelihood of this adverse impact. So those are kind of key points, like essentials of due diligence, what we call. And then yeah, so yes, I'm just because we are running over time, so I'm just going to hand it over to next slide, and then I think it's Shivani's slide. So
yeah,
thank you.
Thanks, Rena. And what we wanted just to talk to you today about really is we have an implementation plan. We have 5 priority actions, and in a nutshell, I think our focus is really how can we've got this guidance, we've got the standard. So what are the ways in which we can really scale up quickly and globally? And so I'm going to just walk us through these 5 actions. And the first one is it's really the first one. If we go to the next slide, please. Sophia, the real first priority is really integrating into recommendations into those regulatory frameworks. And we see that as really a key game changer. But it's also about getting in political buy-in. So we were pretty happy to see that on the EU Code of Conduct from last year, the food and business marketing practices, that the OECD-FAO Guidance is really cited as the key sector framework for due diligence. And this is a core part of the EU Farm to Fork strategy. So that we feel is a good way for us to start getting this political buy-in. This year, we know that we're seeing in the draft communiques of the G7 agricultural ministers, a number of references to responsible business conduct also, but specifically the OECD-FAO guidance. And this is, again, very, very welcome. We're also going to be supporting the G7 presidency this year on a sustainable supply chains initiative, again, focusing on the agriculture and food supply chains. This was launched last year by the UK presidency. It's taken up by the German presidency this year. And we have over 20 global food and agri companies engaged. And actually yesterday, Victoria Bourbon de Parma spoke, I think, to this group, and we'll be working quite closely with WBA to work with those companies to see how can we move forward? What are the additional commitments that can be made to actually achieve a responsible sector output. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is a very important area as well, a growing area. It's the next sort of lever where we can see lots of change and enabling impact at scale is this the work that we're doing with certification groups and certification systems. So here we have a growing practice area across our center, which we call the alignment assessment practice. And the idea here is to engage and work with certification standard setters as well as certification implementers to see how aligned their certification approaches are to our recommendations on due diligence and the 5-step framework, for example. And this has actually been happening in the last 4 or 5 years in our minerals implementation program, which we've had. And so you'll see here on the lower right side, the number of assessments we've done there. We've also continued to do that in our garment and footwear sector. And this year, we're ready to launch a pilot with a certification group in the agricultural sector. So we've developed the methodology, and we're now speaking to a number of potential commodity certification groups to see if there's interest to engage in a pilot this year with us. And of course, as part of this work, we're also working quite closely with Koen and the team at TAD on the paper on certification schemes.
Shivani, I'm just looking at the clock since we don't have that much time left. Is it possible to wrap up so we can have time for the Q&A as well?
Yeah, we can. Let's go to, well, third action here. These are some technical handbooks. Maybe I turn to Sophia to just walk us through the Deforestation Handbook before we just stop for questions. I would say the fourth and fifth policy actions are really in e-learning, which we're also very pleased to highlight. And the fifth one is on really measurement of the impact of the work. But Sophia, why don't you walk us through the work on the Deforestation Handbook?
Sure. So my plan was to provide you with a little bit of background on what's been driving our work on environmental and climate issues, because I think previously in the past, although the M&E guidelines do address environmental issues and our due diligence guidance as well, there's been more of a focus on social and human rights aspects. And now we're really building up the work on the environment and climate change. However, considering the time we have left, I'll just say that last year we published a document called The Role of OECD Instruments on Responsible Business Conduct in Progressing Environmental Objectives. This is a really good resource tool. So if you have an opportunity to look through it, it's a great place to kind of find the background to all of that. I can share it with Koen so he can circulate it so that there's a bit more information there. But one of the things that has come out of our working party is this need for kind of more practical handbooks and support on key environmental priorities, including biodiversity, climate change, circular economy. And as such, we've got 3 environmental handbooks that are coming out this year. Well, they're in the process of development this year, one on environmental due diligence in the minerals sector, one on climate in the garment sector, and then also the one on deforestation in the agricultural sector. And so this is what Shivani was mentioning. It's being developed in collaboration with FAO, so it's a joint piece. It's currently under development, began at the end of last year with the hiring of a consultant and the formulation of a multi-stakeholder expert working group that would kind of support on ensuring that kind of all of the technical aspects are there, that it's practical for business. And it's being developed through this year and is due to be published in Q1 of next year. It was really during the OECD-FAO pilot project of 2018 and 19 that a lot of companies requested really specific tools to address deforestation. So the handbook from the outset was really designed to be practical and to target business and practitioners. And it has a similar approach to OECD's practical actions to identify and address the worst forms of child labor in mineral supply chains. So this is a kind of model that we've developed before, and we're now replicating for different issues in different sectors. It's important to remember that the handbook isn't new guidance or new guidelines, but it just accompanies the existing guidance and that's already been developed. And it builds on the due diligence framework that exists in the guidance that Rena was talking about, so the 5-step framework. So it's really the handbook will address deforestation and in upstream and downstream in supply chains. It will implement due diligence that's risk averse, but also forest positive, will troubleshoot bottlenecks and blind spots within the supply chain, which are obviously key issues for business, and will also kind of seek to address current and forthcoming regulation on due diligence and deforestation, of which there's quite a lot that's coming out. We're seeing it in the EU, we're seeing it in the UK, we're seeing it in the US. So it's been one of the things that the members of our multi-stakeholder working group have really been keen to kind of understand the relationship between this handbook and emerging regulation. The handbook itself will be available in English, but we're planning to develop shorter versions that will be translated into French, Spanish, and Bahasa Indonesia. And it's important to note that a lot of our environment and climate work has actually come out of our regional programs in Latin America and Asia, where there's been specific interest on these topics, because they're quite key challenges for businesses operating in these regions. And just, yeah, a quick note on the multi-stakeholder working group. We tried to develop it so that it was really multi-stakeholder. We have business, we have governments, we have CSOs, NGOs, and academics. They're all feeding in to the handbook to ensure that it is balanced and represents different kind of perspectives and interests. And we've had a lot of feedback from government, because obviously this is quite a sensitive area for a number of the producing countries. So I'll stop there, Koen, because I know that we need time to chat, but I'm very happy to answer any questions on our environment work as well.
Great, thanks to you all for this introduction to the work on due diligence and responsible business conduct. So feel free to ask your questions either using the raise hand function in Zoom or by posting them in the chat. And already one question accidentally got sent to me in the chat instead, so I'll just read that one out loud. The question is whether you're also planning to do any other handbooks on other environmental issues. So you mentioned one on deforestation. Are you also planning other practical advice on other issues?
Yes, we are. We're doing, but let me turn to Sophia first to talk on the environmental ones, and I can talk about the non-environmental, but like social ones that we're also working on.
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly that we have two others underway, one on broad environmental due diligence in the minerals sector, which covers everything from climate change to pollution to water management. So it's really a very broad handbook, and there's lots of issues to cover, so it's been quite challenging. And then for the garment sector, we are focusing specifically on climate change and the contribution of the garment and textile sector to climate change. And those are all going to be coming out at roughly the same time, so towards the end of this year, beginning of next year. And then, yeah, Shivani can talk about the kind of social ones.
Yeah, so in addition to the deforestation and the work for the agri sector and deforestation, we're also developing a technical handbook to address to enable human rights due diligence in the cocoa sector, with a focus on forced labor and child labor. And the third one is a rather unusual one. It's really trying to see how we can begin to integrate a living income, living wage approach in two sectors here, the agricultural sector, because we've got plantations, smallholder farmers, but also the garment sector, where that's again another pressing issue. Again, these handbooks, they're really quite an interesting way. They're almost a derivative of our guidances on due diligence, because the guidances cover so many different risks areas. So what we're trying to do is saying, okay, given this approach of due diligence, which is increasingly being cited in regulation, how do you then address some of these very specific risks? And in some ways, it's really a guide or tech handbook for companies, because we're trying to make it as practical as possible by saying, all right, in thinking about a policy, here are the types of questions you need to ask yourself. What's your level of ambition? What do you actually want to achieve? Who within your company is actually going to be responsible for this? Has budget been given for this? It's very, very, it really is extremely practical. In some ways, it's very un-OECD, if I may say. I mean, I hate to say that, I'm going to get myself into a lot of trouble for this, I can already tell. But Mark Cropper, I can see him laughing. But in some ways, look, let's be serious. If we want to get change to happen, we need to make it understood and applicable. If not, we're just talking to this group of very, very highly educated folks who probably don't really spend time on a farm or a mine. No, I mean, I would guess. Maybe not. I shouldn't speak for other folks. All right.
I think it ties back to something that Victoria mentioned yesterday, which is that she was showing the distribution of the scores, and she said, well, there's a few companies that do very well, and then there's a lot of companies that aren't doing that well. And she's actually, we shouldn't just focus on the ones who are doing really well. We should try to get everybody on board.
That's right. And of course, the SME question is the big one, right? Because we all know that over 95% of the companies that we're talking about, they're not the big, well-known household names. They're not the large companies. They do not have a CSR department. a risk management department. I mean, it's typically 1 or 2 people that are in charge of a number of different things. So, well, how do we get them on board? But I'll stop talking and see if there are more questions, and yeah, or just reactions. It doesn't even have to be a question.
So actually, one question that came in the chats to me again, but is actually following up on what we were just discussing, was that actually a lot of the guidelines, so the guidelines are actually designed for businesses that typically have resources. What about farmers? I guess it relates to your question or your point, Shivani, about small enterprises.
Yeah, so on the small enterprises side, the way we encourage folks is that that's the collaborative aspect of the due diligence work. So we really encourage companies to collaborate with each other, but also to work with industry associations. I know that's not a perfect answer, right? And a lot of people sort of roll their eyes on it, but that is what we've seen as being very helpful. There's really many elements of this due diligence process where, for example, you need to understand what are the risks in a given area or within a given supply chain. And a lot of that data and a lot of that information can be gathered and shared in a pre-competitive way. And we really encourage industry associations to take on that role. There's also a fair amount of work, classic basic work that actually large companies can do, just training their suppliers and rolling it down and actually getting their suppliers on board, which actually many companies already do. I mean, they've got pretty, depending on the company you speak, they've got pretty extraordinary supplier engagement type programs. That's some of the things we're thinking about. And then look, to be very frank, some of these tools that we're coming up with, or these handbooks, because of these simplified questions that we're putting in, we're hoping that this will also be very helpful for time-strapped SMEs that can just really deep dive, say, okay, well, what is it that I actually need to know and do? So there's that. But to be very frank, so those are some of the ways. The other big area that could potentially help is in technology, and we're beginning to see some of that. And there's some really interesting shared technology that's being put out there. For example, I'm going to mix up the name number. I think it's the tropical forest. It's not the tropical, but it's the forest. It's the forest project where they actually put. Sophia, do you know which one I'm talking about? It's where they've actually done satellite scans and they've put the data. It's actually publicly accessible. So we're seeing ways that broadly different groups are coming together to help fill out this space. Coming back to this individual farmer, I would say these guidances are not targeted directly to the small, what's the word, independent single household farmer. That's not. It really has to be. It's a business. Minimum business cooperative type model. But what I would just add that, what I do find to be refreshing about this particular approach that the OECD has developed is that it's not a checklist approach. It's really quite a flexible framework that it's adaptable to a company size and the ambition. And I think that's actually, that's the way we need to think about this as a journey of working towards reaching, completely, responsible and, let's quote unquote, clean supply chains. And I think that's one of the, as I said, one of the real value adds as well of this approach of due diligence, which is quite reflective of the dynamic nature of supply chains.
Interesting. Sophia, I'll give you the final word before we go into the breakouts.
Oh, okay. No, I was thinking, Shivani, I think it was Global Forest Watch maybe that you were thinking of in there. But then also, I just wanted to say, I think with regards to smallholders and smaller operators upstream in your supply chain, there is an acknowledgement within the guidelines and the guidance that businesses should be playing a role in supporting the activities of their suppliers, and whether that is that means a financial support, whether that is training, whether that is whatever form it may take. The idea is that you do not pass the blame and you do not pass the buck. There is a responsibility that businesses have. But it's true that a lot of, not just, a lot of the regulation that's coming out is also targeting larger businesses and multinational enterprises. It doesn't, there's always a kind of scale element to the regulation that says, companies above this size, and kind of tends to ignore the SMEs, which it was interesting. I was in a session yesterday where they were talking about this, and actually someone from the UK was saying, well, it's ironic because sometimes SMEs and smaller companies are actually more flexible and more dynamic. And if they're entrepreneurial, they often have this real sense that they want their business to be doing good as well as making money. So often we see that some of the most innovative people in the sector are actually the smaller businesses, because they can do more and more quickly. Whereas if you've got a bigger ship, you've got a bigger company, it's actually harder to change direction and get all of those different divisions and all of those different kind of units that are operating in different countries to change. So I thought that was a kind of a nice thing to kind of reflect on, is actually, although we often say, oh, SMEs and smaller businesses can't do it or can't meet these standards, sometimes they're actually better placed to do it. But
in fact, I totally agree with that. I think that sometimes we need to rethink this view, maybe we should be saying like, look, this is a real opportunity for SMEs to actually demonstrate how they can actually meet some of these expectations more easily, because generally SMEs would have fewer suppliers that they would have to, in the first place, work with, and they tend to know quite well who their suppliers are. But it depends. It really depends on. I think it's still fair to say that many SMEs are struggling just to understand. I mean, many of them don't even have the time or the energy to read through some of this work. I mean, we've put all these guidances out, and they're just like, God, can you put this in a 2-pager, please? Yeah. Okay.
Great. Thanks for the great discussion. We went a little bit over time, but it was an interesting conversation. Yeah. Didn't want to cut it short. So with that sort of finishes the formal parts of the informal webinar. So thank you very much for the presentation, and also to all the people who were posting questions in the chat. I didn't manage to actually read all of those. My apologies. So we're gonna move into the breakout sessions now. If you don't want to join for the breakouts, feel free to just leave the meeting now, because otherwise you might get allocated to a meeting, and then that just makes things a bit more difficult.